Thank you all. It's a tremendous pleasure to be back here at Easton. I feel a little like the Queen of Sheba who said to Solomon, the half was never told me, because I thought at the end of a busy day you might have a little seminar for 20 or 30 people and we'd go out for a glass of something afterwards. I had no idea of the augustness of the Agora Institute. Anyway, it's a real privilege to be here. My only disappointment is my old friend and fellow social scientist, Tony Campolo, is not here tonight. He told me he was somewhere else this evening. But I remember one time when we were both speaking on the same platform, when I hadn't been too long in this country, and I spoke first, and he was second, and I can't for a moment mimic his accent. But he got up and he said, "Why do you listen to this fellow?" He said, "He speaks with this English accent, and you have to listen for 20 minutes before you realize he's not saying anything." And here I am, and I speak with my Philadelphia accent, and I have to speak for 20 minutes before you realize I am saying something. But sadly, I don't have Tony to get back on tonight. No, it's a real privilege. This topic, I think, is one of the keys to the human future. Because what we're talking about in one word would be what Roger Williams called soul freedom. Freedom of thought and conscience. And beyond any doubt, what anchors it best of all is civility, properly understood. And where above all is soul freedom and civility to be demonstrated usefully in the public square, the Agora. Now, if you think back over the last 25 years, at any moment in this time, it would be true that someone somewhere in the world was being killed in the name of religion. And we can all think of the terrible arc of violence around the world created by sectarian violence. And of course, sectarian violence is only one of the three great sources of how this is a trouble today. The first, of course, government repressions. The second, sectarian violence. And increasingly the third, the violations looking much more petty in many of our Western nations as we're increasingly having culture wars that we've had here in America for the last 50 years. Put it together and you can see that living with our deep differences, especially when those differences are religious and ideological, is one of the world's great issues. But it sounds very abstract compared with HIV/AIDS or terrorism or the nuclear proliferation. Very abstract. And yet if you think this issue lies below the other issues and will only get more urgent as we go into the future, discuss things like biogenetic engineering, transhuman, this, that, and the other, and so on. How do we live with our deep differences? Now, you can easily see how this has become a global issue. We're in a world, because of the media and travel, and above all the mass movements of people, where it's now said that everyone is now everywhere. A little exaggerated, but you can see that there's never been such diversity in so many societies. And not just a little multiplicity of private religious preferences, but entire worldviews and entire ways of life, elbow to elbow, with other entire worldviews and ways of life within the same society. And this is our world. But then the urgency is added to that because you can see, secondly, that many of the traditional settlements of solving religion and public life are floundering. We take them as something that's been there forever. But if you look at many of our Western settlements, say the French or the English or the American, each of them was a product of a specific year that was transformative for its nation and cast a long shadow down the centuries. So the French, 1789, you can capture their so-called laïcité when you think of the cry that was picked up from Diderot, the philosophe, and came down to the Jacobin radicals, The world will never be happy until we strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. Now, if you unpack that, you see that you had before, in the Ancien Regime, a church and a state in deep collusion, both thoroughly oppressive. So the revolution threw off both church and state, and in France then and in France today, if you're in favor of faith, you're reactionary. And if you're in favor of freedom, you're secular. And that mentalité, that mindset, as the French say, comes right down to today, as you can see the French state butting its head, say, with Muslim headscarves and many other issues. Clearly unable to handle the extraordinary degree of immigration from North Africa and other parts of the world. In my own country, the key year was 1688, the Glorious Revolution. The retention of established church, the Anglican Church, but partly to be a bulwark of Protestantism to offset the menace of Catholicism across the Channel, particularly from Louis XIV and France. Now, the English establishment has no blood on its hands, like the French. There was no massacre of the Huguenots. So there was no militant anti-clericalism in the English history since 1688, but it's an establishment. And slowly it's faded away, so as the cynics say today, it's only there for the hatching, matching, and dispatching of citizens. Baptize them, marry them, bury them, and so on. That's a little cynical. But clearly the Church of England finds itself numerically and culturally, and above all theologically and spiritually, extremely weak, caught between the pincer of an aggressive secularism on one side and a growing Islam on the other side, and fading away into relative irrelevance. Your American settlement clearly comes from 1791 and the First Amendment. Religion disestablished, and as you all know well, flourishing not despite disestablishment, but because of it. I myself and many admirers of this country would agree with James Madison, as he put it in the Memorial and Remonstrance, that the American settlement was the true remedy for religion in public life. But you Americans can't congratulate yourself, because the last 50 years have seen an increasing deterioration in that settlement, so today it's unrecognizable. After 50 years of culture warring, set off by Madeleine Murray O'Hare's early school prayer cases, right down to the recent controversies over contraception, with all the controversies in between, clearly the American culture wars have made nonsense of the arrangements that the framers set up so powerfully. But there's a third factor that brings this close to home. And that is, today we're seeing the emergence of a very rudimentary but very real global public square. Now, if you think, going back, as RJ said, to the Greeks, we prize the agora, not just the place for goods being sold and exchanged, but the place for citizens to debate and deliberate and decide the issues of common public life. So, for the Greeks, the agora; for the Romans, the forum, it was a physical place, and always has been in some ways. So we have the Congress on Capitol Hill, we have the Parliament in Westminster, you have the French Assembly in Paris, a physical place. But you know well that the phrase public square is also a metaphor. And especially in the English-speaking world, it came to include anywhere, not just Congress or Westminster, but anywhere where citizens were debating issues of common public life, the op-ed pages of the newspaper or talk shows or whatever. But significantly now, in the age of the internet, we're shifting from the physical, adding the metaphorical, and now the virtual. And if you think of the significance, say, of the fatwas against Salman Rushdie, or the responses to the Danish cartoon controversy, or to the Pope's speech at Regensburg, you can see a very, very simple point. Even when we're not speaking to the world, in the age of the internet, we can be heard by the world, and the world can organize its response. And we're seeing, because of this, the growth of the beginning, as I said, very rudimentary, but of a global public square, which is raising the issue of how do we live with deep differences to a level we've never faced before in humankind. And of course, other technological factors are added in. We were discussing at supper the influence, say, of anonymity in the blogs. People who take anonymous screen names often comment on blogs in ways that are thoroughly barbaric, humanly degrading. They would never do if they were identifiable and accountable with their real names. And so it goes with things like sound bites and many other issues. We're at a stage where this question of how we live with our deep differences, especially religious differences and ideological differences, is now a grand global question. And surely, we who are called to be followers of Jesus, to know how to speak the truth with love, to forgive without any limit, to love even our enemies, we of all people should be in the forefront of contributing to the recovery of civility in our time over these crucial issues. Well, let me open this up tonight just by putting a number of very simple propositions to you. First, we need to be clear ourselves as to why soul freedom or freedom of thought and conscience is so vital. Both religion and religious liberty are under a dark cloud in educated circles today. Think of three very simple reasons why religious freedom is in fact primary and precious. Now, I don't mean just to say this to you tonight, but to challenge each of us to be able to make these arguments out in the public square where clearly this is not appreciated. The first is that for the framers rightly, religious liberty was logically and historically the first liberty. We're told again and again today it's invidious to have a hierarchy of rights. And that's true. But the framers understood well that each of the three core freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly, were interlocking and inseparable. And as you see the relationships between them, soul freedom, freedom of thought and conscience is the first liberty. Freedom of assembly is, of course, crucial, but it assumes and requires freedom of speech. You don't want to get together with people just to talk about something trivial, although that too is protected, but to talk about something that matters because you want to speak freely about it. But equally, freedom of speech assumes and requires freedom of conscience. We're not speaking out about anything, but above all those things of which we are convinced because we are bound by the dictates of conscience. And as many point out today, there's a huge difference in modern American freedom of choice, where we are sovereign choosers, and freedom of conscience, where we are subjects because we are bound, and as Martin Luther said, I can do no other, and therefore conscience is respected. Now, we need to make that argument today at a time when I've heard people argue that religious liberty is liberty of the religious. Religious liberty in the religious liberty clauses is like the appendix in the body. We can lose an appendix easily and live happily, and the same with this. It's a constitutional redundancy. No, we need to say, of the three basic core freedoms and rights, soul freedom, as Roger Williams put it, soul freedom, freedom of thought and conscience is the first liberty. You can see in the recent discussion of the contraception issues in the last few weeks how many people are secular and liberal simply were totally ignorant, not necessarily opposed, completely ignorant of American history. And Andy and I were discussing at supper how many in the administration now are talking about freedom of worship, as if that was the same as freedom of conscience. No. Any tyrant can recognize freedom of worship, and you can practice freedom of worship in your heart in the worst cell that a tyrant could provide for you. But in the Virginia Declaration that was mentioned tonight, young Madison, 23 years old and shy, persuaded them to change George Mason's words toleration, coming from John Locke, and put in the two new words, free exercise. That is freedom, and that is very different from freedom of worship. The second reason why it's important is that freedom of conscience underlies civil society. We're told by Christopher Hitchens and his ilk that religion poisons everything. But anyone who looks at it fairly realizes that's simply not so. And many of the greatest contributions to human justice in all sorts of areas come from faith when it is free to act into what we now call civil society. And you know the discussion that between citizens at the individual level and the government at the top level, a society is healthy if there is a thick layering of organizations in which citizens can volunteer and engage and participate and give. There is a healthy civil society. But everything shows it's when people are free to do that 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 flourishes above all. In other words, the equivalent of demonopolization in business and what we call a level playing field in business is disestablishment in religion and freedom of conscience for all. So every faith community stands on its own feet, and depending on its own vision, its own enterprise, and its own sacrifice, and its own generosity, it has the freedom to enter and engage and make the difference that it wants to do, and you have a healthy, flourishing civil society. The third reason why religious freedom is so important is one of the keys, rightly handled, to social harmony. I was born in China, as was mentioned. The current president of China, not the one now visiting, the current president, Hu Jintao, often speaks fondly and ardently of what he calls a harmonious society. But when I'm at, say, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Shanghai or Beijing, I say that is no big deal. China has extraordinary diversity and extraordinary relative harmony. It's no big deal because that's just a silent argument for authoritarian coercion. In other words, diversity plus coercion, and you get harmony. The real challenge is to have diversity with liberty and still achieve harmony. And probably of any great country, America has come closer to that than any nation in history. Now, you yawn as Americans because you're so used to it. But in many ways, you can come as a foreigner and see what this country has done at its best. And I know the egregious violations, including the riots here in Philadelphia in the 1830s. I know the violations in the egregious blind spots. But having said that, by and large, this country has brought together two things that rarely go together. On the one hand, strong religious convictions, and on the other hand, strong political civility. Now, one or the other is easy. I grew up in post-war Western Europe. Any of you visited in those years before the late 70s and the explosion of immigration from South Asia, North Africa, and so on, you'll know that Europe in that time was remarkably civil about religion, with only one exception, Ulster. Remarkably civil. But anyone in Europe would say no big deal. There wasn't much religion to be uncivil about. So you compare Europe and America then. Take, say, the Scandinavians. Where the Scandinavians have settled in this country, take the upper Midwest, Minnesota and so on, church-going still in the 70%, way above the American average of a rather steady 40. What was it in Sweden at the time? 3%. Well, the Europeans weren't going to squabble about religion when you had such low attendance. But of course, in the Middle East, you had the opposite problem. Passionate religious convictions, no civility, no liberty, often no life. This country has done a remarkable job, and Madison's true remedy has in fact been demonstrated, as I said, until recently with the culture warring. But we need to make arguments for religious liberty in the public square and make Americans today reappreciate what is fundamental to the history and to the genius of this country. Secondly, let me go on to examine some of the common weaknesses of responses to the recent problems. And this touches many Christians and some liberals too. One common mistake, and you can see this in evangelical circles, is to fight the violations of religious liberty by law alone. If we go back to Cicero or to Polybius or come down to the modern discussion with Montesquieu and certainly with Alexis de Tocqueville, there's a consensus, to put it in Montesquieu's terms, that freedom is protected not only by the structures of liberty, such as the Constitution, but by the spirit of liberty in the hearts of citizens. And it's out of that that Tocqueville says that American freedom is not just protected by law, but by, famously, the habits of the heart. Now you can see quite clearly that American society as a whole was secularized in the 1920s. And ever since then there's a tendency to legalize things and to litigate things. In that sense the law covers everything rather than ethics and so on. In the 1980s, when I was doing the Williamsburg Charter, one of the leaders of the ACLU said to me, there's a simple reason why we will always win the culture wars. We have more lawyers than anyone else. They don't now. Their array of lawyers, their massive defense funds, their endless litigations are matched by equally strong array of lawyers, defense funds, and litigation on the conservative side. Now, don't misunderstand me. Law and the rule of law and due process are a vital protection of freedom, but not by themselves alone. And when we fight everything to protect freedom by law alone, we just increase the litigation and the litigiousness. And law is simply too blunt an instrument. Just look at the zigzagging in the Supreme Court in the last 50 years. Law is simply too blunt an instrument to deal with some of these things, many of which could be solved in 5 minutes by genuine civility as a matter of the habits of the heart. And conservatives are making a very bad mistake thinking we have to fight everything through lawyers and litigation. And sadly, this mentality, which the Christian right started unwittingly, is now spreading to various European countries, and the same alarmism and fear-mongering and litigation is entering the Christian spirit in Europe. Freedom is never protected by law alone. Law is precious, but you also and always need the habits of the heart. The second common mistake is to fight for our interests and not the common good. Now, we of all people as Christians should not do that. Our Lord is often described as a man for others. The church is often described as the only club that's here for its non-members of the club. And we know again and again from the Old Testament and New Testament the problems that come when blessings are turned into us and restricted to those outside. And yet you can see persistently with the religious right, they have fought for their own interests, not for the common good. But the simple fact is that religious liberty is a matter of mutuality and reciprocity. A right for one is a right for another, and a responsibility for both. A right for a Christian is a right for a Jew, is a right for an atheist, is a right for a Mormon or a Muslim or whatever. And unless we remember that, and one aspect of that is that it's when the tiniest community is protected and the most unfashionable community knows they're protected, then everyone's rights are protected. And merely to fight for our rights at the expense of others is an extremely fatal mistake that Christians have made. The third common mistake today is to seek to fight the negative only with the negative. And this one you can see also in liberal circles. For example, liberals concerned with sensitivity or with hate speech sought to regulate these things, such as hate speech, whether in political correct regulations or worse. And this is why Muslims, of course, liberals, of course, were so open to Muslims who came in and wanted laws against defamation and insult and blasphemy and apostasy and so on. And you can see in issues like that, as well as their common dislike of conversion, you can see how liberals and Muslims have this curious alliance at various points, but in ways that they're now seeing become illiberal. Take, for instance, the current so-called phobiaization. So I don't like your speech, so I describe you as suffering from one phobia or another, and I can silence you that way. So gays have picked this up, and everyone who disagrees is a homophobe. Now the Muslims have picked this up, and everyone who disagrees with them is an Islamophobe. And sadly, some Christians have been tempted to say, yes, with this culture war on Christians in this country and this general assault on Christians worldwide, which is true, we should play the so-called Christophobe card. And you can see Christians calling that absolutely disastrous. All it does is to silence the debate, and especially muzzle making of points that are absolutely necessary to be made. And we need to challenge. The end result is highly illiberal, even when it's done by liberals. And as I said, they're playing into the hands of Muslims. Now, when Muslims do this, let's be very clear, they are deliberately, in many cases, trying to disembowel the heart of universal human rights. Freedom of conscience is a protection of believers. It is not a protection of beliefs. And Muslims are trying to turn that round so that the regulation of hate speech and their own versions of insult, blasphemy, and so on become a protection not only of beliefs, but of one belief, namely Islam. And that is a fundamental disemboweling of human rights that would be very fateful. And again, partly through ignorance, partly through this rather odd partnership between liberals and Muslims, doors have been opened in this way which are undermining Western human rights, which are really a stand for universal human rights. Let me move on thirdly to the heart of the whole issue. We need to assess the competing visions and models for religion and public life. Most of the debate in the world is a duel between two grand visions, sometimes called the sacred public square and the naked public square. The model of the sacred public square are those who believe that a particular religion should be preferred or established. Now, of course, you can have very mild versions of that. Probably the mildest is the one I mentioned, the Church of England. No one is likely to be burned at the stake by the Church of England. The Church of England couldn't agree on a truth to be a standard for heresy. So the Church of England is about as mild as you... I'm an Anglican, and I'm not speaking... I am speaking against my own church. It's about as mild as you can get. Obviously, at the other end, you have a very severe form of the sacred public square, say Iran or Saudi Arabia. And we know the lack of liberty, religiously and otherwise, that you have in societies like that. And there are examples somewhere in the middle. We have a whole range across the world of versions and models of the sacred public square. But clearly, if any one religion is preferred, let alone established and exclusive and monopolistic, all the others are to some degree second class, and therefore their liberty may be called into question. In other words, at some point, that model becomes unjust and unworkable. The other extreme, and again we have a whole range of variations, is the naked public square. Probably what the ACLU would like and Americans United would like is a relatively mild version of it. It's certainly not nearly as draconian as, say, the French laïcité. And that, of course, is positively genial and hospitable compared with the Chinese People's Republic. A whole range of models, and to put it mildly again, in the diversity of today's world, those models inevitably will be unjust and unworkable because they don't do full justice to the diversity we have in the world. The way forward, many of us think, is through what's called a civil public square. What does that mean? A vision of public life in which everyone of every faith is free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. That's freedom of conscience and free exercise. But, here's the big but, within an agreed framework of what is just and free for everybody else too. So that I said, a right for one is a right for another, and a responsibility for both. Now, civility itself needs re-exploring today and revaluing. And let me be clear about some of the common misunderstandings which are just as common in Christian circles as they are in wider circles. One misunderstanding of civility is that civility is niceness, a sort of kumbaya hope that if we love people enough and talk to them nicely long enough, finally we'll all agree. What nonsense. Civility is a classical virtue and a duty that is essential for societies with diversity that need to know how citizens get on with each other. And we need to recover that in a strong way today. It is not a matter of tea party manners, dinner etiquette, or niceness. The second misunderstanding, and this is far more important theologically, is the idea that civility is a form of lowest common denominator ecumenism. In other words, we each dilute our truths in order to find a common core of unity, at which point we'll all agree. No. That, as you know, is a recipe for faithlessness, but it's also a fruitless search. Because the simple fact is that at the level of our deep assumptions, religious or ideological, our differences are ultimate and irreducible. And there is no common core. And we need to combat the Hans Kuhngs, the Karen Armstrongs, even, I'm afraid, the Tony Blairs and people like this who are seeing this search for peace and unity at the expense of truth claims with this idea we'll find the lowest common denominator. My own picture for a long time has been the Queensberry rules in boxing. Any of you know the history of sport? The Romans, believe it or not, banned boxing and kept the gladiatorial games because they thought boxing was too brutal. Well, anyway, they did, but it was pretty brutal. If you look at the London prize fights or the Colorado bare-knuckle fights, you see sometimes they fought for 100 rounds over a heath, and one or other of the fighters died at the end of it. And then in the mid-19th century, the Marquis of Queensberry in London, the time of Britain's sporting earls, when soccer and golf and all sorts of things flourished, the Marquis of Queensberry lent his name to the Queensberry rules. Boxing was put in a ring, under a referee, within rules. For example, you don't punch below the belt. But here's the point. While you have the Queensberry rules, they still fight. And they may touch gloves at the beginning, but then they go at it for 10, 12, 15 rounds, or whatever it is. And that, of course, is politics. William Wilberforce entered the ring. And for 20 years, round after round, year after year, as it were, he lost on points. Finally, in 1807, knocked the slave trade out of the ring. And in 1833, slavery itself. And of course, we expect that in politics. This year, the Democrats are in. Many of you Republicans hope by the end of this year, the Democrats will be out. But whoever's in and out doesn't take to arms. We know some are in and some are out. That's politics. And in the same way, a civil public square is not a great kumbaya moment of love-in. No, it's an agreement of what's just and fair for people of all faiths, within which people are free to argue their position and trust that their positions will prevail. Now, of course, you can see the challenge of that. Those who would prevail must persuade. And you can see, again, a huge weakness, say, of evangelicals. We're good at protests, pronouncements, preaching, picketing, all sorts of things. One of our great weaknesses today is public persuasion, which is assumed and required in a civil public square. The third misunderstanding of civility, and this is one shared not only by Christian fundamentalists but also atheist fundamentalists like Richard Dawkins, is that civility is a form of sloppy indifference to truth. If you've read Dawkins, he's incredibly intolerant and proud of it. As he says, I don't just refuse to tolerate extremists, I don't tolerate moderates who tolerate extremists, and so on, and so on, and so on, because he wants to fight for his atheistic view of truth. But actually, they're wrong in misunderstanding civility. I put it like this. The right to believe anything does not mean that anything anyone believes is right. The right to believe anything is freedom of conscience. And we respect people's right. God respects people's right. If people choose eternity without him, God doesn't rape their souls, to use William's term. The right to believe anything is absolute. But that doesn't mean for a minute that anything they believe is right. And much that people believe may be muddle-headed, socially disastrous, or maybe profoundly morally evil. And we have the right and the responsibility to challenge them. And we hope to prevail over them in public debate, but having to use persuasion and not coercion. Let me draw this towards a conclusion. I think we can learn a lot today from the story of human rights themselves. Just take the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration is misused. Some people have made it the Bible of an atheist concern for human rights. But at its best, it has done a tremendous amount across the world, and you can see the stages by which it's made that effect. Stage one is always declaration. The Universal Declaration itself has nothing binding in it at all. It is only a series of more than 30 ringing declarations of principle. Nothing binding. It's a beacon. Stage two is implementation. That came 10, 15, 20, 25 years later in many countries as they adopted those principles and put them in their constitution or in their laws. But even that itself is not enough. And stage three is the very important one, which is the least followed, which is education. Education is where, from parents to children and professors to students, these things become habits of the heart. And only when they're truly habits of the heart, they're in the spirit of the citizens, not just the structures of laws, is freedom and justice really protected. Now you can see America has these ringing declarations, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and so on and so on. And we have the Constitution. But where we've grown very weak is the third one, civic education. Used to be understood clearly that in free societies, everybody's born free, but not everyone's equal to freedom. Not everyone's worthy of freedom. And so they need to be, as it was said, educated for liberty. Used to be called liberal education, but the L word's under a cloud too. in conservative circles, liberal education or civic education. And you can see for 50 years that's dropped out of education in this country by and large. So even here, all America's great stand for justice and freedom, you can see that the full range of things is not being followed through today. And not surprisingly, many of these profound rights are becoming distant and somewhat alien to Americans growing up. But we need declaration, we need implementation, and we need civic education to carry it down to the habits of the heart. And if this is true here, it's true all over the world. And I'll just mention, some of us are working on a global declaration of freedom of conscience that may be published later this year. But if it is, we should know that any declaration of freedom of conscience by itself will do nothing unless it's followed up by implementation and then finally followed up with civic education so that it comes down to kids and passes from generation to generation. Now, in finishing, let me be clear. I do not believe there's any one-size-fits-all solution. Every country in the world is different, has its own history, its own cultural values. But my own suggestion is that countries, for all their differences, and the differences are shaped by history and other things, for all their differences should be challenged to expand the sphere within their settlement in which the three core freedoms of conscience, of speech, and of assembly are expanded and expanded for people of all faiths and no faith. Now, equally, I would be realistic to say this is unlikely in many parts of the world anytime soon. If you were to divide the world very simplistically in terms of human rights between this country, which has grappled with these things longer and more successfully than any other part of the world, and lagging a good way behind much of the rest of the West, like Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where we, because I'm European, have the principles, but they've never flowered as they've flowered here. And then, of course, there are other parts of the world, such as China, where I was born, or the Middle East, that many of us follow daily, where the chances of these things changing in any time soon are very rare. To admirers of America, it's a tragedy that while the founders and many of the revolutionary generation picked up things like Livy's Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages, or saw themselves as a city on a hill, or the first new nation, to use a more recent phrase. When the founders and others said that 230 odd years ago, the rest of the world, frankly, wasn't interested. They went on their ancient ways, unimpressed. But if you understand the world today, the entire world now is beginning to grapple with the explosive issues which America grappled with from the beginning. Massive immigration, exploding diversity, etc., etc., etc. And at the very moment that America is more relevant than ever to the world, America's gone AWOL and is just fighting its culture wars. And I know Europeans who said, I suddenly realized what the American experiment's about, and then I look at what they're doing. No better than we are. Tocqueville, whom you of course love because he wrote Democracy in America as a gigantic poem of praise to this country. But you know Tocqueville wrote the book in French for Frenchmen, not to Americans. He was a grand admirer of this country, and he was a very disappointed lover of his own revolution. And all his writings, right down to old age, he's exploring and explaining and contrasting and comparing the two. But he had, towards the end of his life, a wonderful little sentence always intrigued me. Tocqueville says, thinking of the American and the French revolutions, with a revolution, as with a novel, the hardest part to invent is the ending. I would challenge you Americans, maybe we're not all Americans here tonight, but I would challenge you as a great admirer of this country from Europe. Your founders made their mistakes. Race, badly wrong. Women, badly wrong. But they got religious liberty and freedom of conscience almost nearly perfectly right from the beginning. They wrote an extraordinary first chapter on this issue. And many noble chapters have been written since then. But your generation, I'm speaking now to those of your students, your generation is described by futurists as the crunch generation, in the sense that many of the demographic, economic, technological, nuclear, environmental issues that are converging in the world and will require solid answers in your adulthood, after some of us older geezers have long gone. If your generation answers them well, humankind may be in for some calmer sailing. If they answer them badly or just drift and don't answer them at all, there could be very, very turbulent times ahead for humanity. And here's an issue in which I think the American experiment and American history holds the key. But Americans today are not demonstrating it. Now, as I started, here we are, followers of Jesus. We're called always to speak the truth with love, to love even our enemies, to forgive without limit. So of all people, not just for our freedom, and not even just for the freedom of the gospel to preach it and live it, but for the sake of human flourishing, here is a day for American Christians to get into the forefront of the world's issues with a distinctively, decisively Christian answer, owing much to the greatness of the American past. Thank you. But I think with good apologetics, you don't just dig in with our arguments, you try and make the case to them, whoever they are. In this case, they happen to be, let's say, liberal, but I'm not particularly attacking the L people. But the problem with all that sort of liberalism is it's highly illiberal. Take a current example. The extreme gay activists, I'll underline the extreme. The extreme gay activists have said religious liberty, civil liberty, one. So now when they clash, you have people like Kai Feldman in the White House. You know, civil liberty trumps religious liberty. So religious liberty, which used to be inalienable, inviolable, a precious right, when religious liberty was valued and people of faith were valued, is now seen as, quote, an obstruction. Well, you know, they sweep all before them in what she calls a zero-sum game, this scorched earth policy. But what she's doing is actually creating, not she, but all the people around her too, a Nietzschean moment. If you have two rights that are clashing, you have to negotiate them. Both are inalienable. You have to see how you work it out in practice. But if one is allowed to trump the other as a pure objection, get out of the way, it's no longer a right. And what they're saying, in effect, is it's just power games. Now, in the overreaching of the gays like that, they started to worry some of their fellow liberals. Now, in the same way in what you're talking about, it's interesting that while Europe is very secular and America is much more religious, or maybe it's partly because of that, the new cracks in the ice in the university worlds are coming from Europe. And the equivalent of John Rawls, who's been so influential in this country, is in Europe, Jürgen Habermas. Habermas argues strongly now that to deny any religious voice is illiberal. And he's saying this to his fellow atheist liberals. Now, we've got to make those sort of arguments. Now, it's not defend our right to get in there. You prize open debate. You prize freedom. You prize liberality, and press them back to see as liberals they're not actually being liberal. Now, when it's a question of, well, who else do you want to speak? Well, we're happy to say something too. But I think that's good apologetics, rather than just sort of a defensive blitzkrieg because they're attacking us. I mean, I've sometimes been at Harvard. I laugh. I have more freedom to speak at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences or Beida University in Beijing or Fudan in Shanghai than I would at Harvard. Chinese are remarkably open, talking about faith and all these things, quite openly in the university situation, rather than Harvard. So I know what you're saying. But turn the arguments back on them. They're being illiberal as liberals. And they do, most of them, prize their liberality. Put another way, the key to talking to the extremists, like the gays, is their overreach. My friend and mentor is Peter Berger. Peter doesn't actually like apologetics. He's open about that. He takes the kind of Barthian view that it's not a thing to do. Anyway, he gives in his books actually what are magnificent apologetic arguments against that sort of postmodern relativizing skepticism. And Peter says there are two ways you approach it. When I started to think about them, they're actually both like profoundly biblical. There's a negative way and a positive way. The negative way is what he says, relativize the relativizers. Whatever their point of skepticism is, don't give an answer to it. Just press them out to be true to it until the point they can't be, because relativizers always cheat. Always. They're skeptical about this but not that, about us but not themselves, etc. Please relativize the relativizers. Now, Jesus says, by their fruit you know them, not the seed, the fruit. Lewis says, follow an idea out to the absolute ruddy end, a very English way of saying it. Francis Schaeffer, the logic of their assumptions. That's the negative. The positive, Peter says, is point them to the signals of transcendence. In other words, everyone, despite what they say, if our faith is true, will have elements of deep human experiences which are like a signal that bleep, 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 and punctures what they currently believe and points beyond and only fulfilled if God is there. And in the Rumor of Angels, Peter uses things like judgment and so on to show how that's so. And I found those two, there's no one you can't speak to if you use either of those. But this would be my parallel. I think the closest parallel to where we are today is St. Augustine. He was at the end. You know, he witnesses Theodosius declaring the empire Christian, the so-called Christian times, and he witnesses Visigoth. He doesn't witness, but he hears the story of the Visigoth rampaging through Rome in 410. And he lived at that transitional interim moment, but he had the courage to break with all the mistaken Christian ideas of his day, and in his vision and things like the city of God, he in essence lays the foundations, the wrong word because you have something more mobile, he creates the bridge that takes the church across into and through the Dark Ages. And as you know, when people like Dawkins often saddle us Christians, well, the Dark Ages was when religion flourished. Religion produced it. That's nonsense. Historians like Christopher Dawson and many others point out the Dark Ages were terribly dark. But the church was the ark, Noah's Ark, on which learning and civilization and education sailed through by the skin of its teeth and landed the other side, and Christendom came. So that's what I would see. You are so laying the core essentials of faith and humanity and growth and thinking and all these things, that whether people have technology or not, say you had the second Dark Ages in the most remarkable time, you would be giving your people enough to carry them through the darkest hours. That's what I think you should be thinking of. Personally, I'm not apocalyptic, and I'm very skeptical about the futurism. Futurism is a quack science. All they do is take the extreme things of today and project them. I'm currently reading George Friedman's The Next 100 Years. How does he know? He doesn't know any more than I do. So I'm very wary of some of that stuff. But we look at that, the Pollyannas, the Dark Ages, apocalyptic, and we're faithful today. But the question is, are we giving our children the heart of the gospel and the heart of the business, so that whether it's boom times or disaster, they have it, and they can sail through that next time safely and strongly? That's, I think, the question. Now, as I understand Augustine, obviously he takes our Lord, we're in the world but not of the world. The city of God, the city of man, etc., etc. it sort of struck me, terribly easy to say. We're in, not of. We're not conformed, we're transformed. We're against the world, for the world. And you can roll off with all these things. You know, we plunder the Egyptian gold, we don't set up the golden calf. We all know these things, they all make nice verbal play. But obviously the key thing is to say at any particular moment, is the word decisive or the world? Is the Spirit of God decisive or the spirit of the age? And my sadness in much of the Christian circles today, you can find Christians who smell a humanist at 100 yards. You know, their noses have been conscientized to humanists. Like, they couldn't describe the consumerist society and its implications for capitalism, let alone for the gospel. And I think we've got to have people have the courage to look at every defining feature of our advanced modern society and strip it down before the Lord, and then say, yes, to resist it, we've got to recognize it, and we're in it but not of it, and that's what you're passing on to your students in the next generation. I'm sure you're doing a magnificent job. Persuasion. That's a huge topic. So, butting heads is ideas, but most of the persuasion when people are closed is much more humble, creative, subversive, and not like this. I'd love to see someone do a sociology of all the current debates, say with Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, or Richard Dawkins, or A.C. Grayling, or Sam Harris, how effective they've been. Because in many of them, increasingly, Christians are winning the argument with blitzkrieg-type battering ram approaches and losing the audiences, or people are just coming out unchanged, for what I've seen in parts of Europe and over here. Now, that can be debated, but that's that style. I don't think it's very good apologetics. Our Lord, no, take some of the subversive approaches to persuasion you have in the Scripture. In other words, when people are closed, indifferent, hostile, whatever, there's a switch from propositions and statements to questions, to parables, to dramatic ploys, to reframing techniques. Now, Kierkegaard, who explores a lot of this, he says we've got to have a humble apologetics, and here's two pictures of it. One is a midwife. Now, the Lord is bringing people to birth through the power of the Spirit. We are mere midwife, not us. The other is what he says, I'm a dramatic prompter. You know, people know the play, they've just forgotten a line or two, and you're just putting words back in to get them thinking along, and so on. And his approach is humble like that, and that's what the best Christian persuasion is. Not us pronouncing things that are better arguments than them and browbeating them. No, that isn't persuasive. So I had dinner a number of years ago with the guy who founded MTV, obviously an extremely astute in knowing how to quote, persuade, if not more, a teenage opinion. And, you know, he said to some of us, the pro-life movement lacks persuasion. Picketing, pronouncements, all that, there's no persuasion. He said if they'd all been persuasive, and he mentioned the Tomas television ads of the time, they would have won the debate long ago. Well, the same is true now, say, of traditional marriage and same-sex marriage. We can't say the Bible says, or use many of the arguments Christians are using. We've got to know how to couch those arguments in persuasive ways that are atheist arguments to atheists. That's Paul. I'm a Jew to the Jews, Gentile to Gentiles, all things to all people, to win them to Christ. We've got to relearn Christian persuasion. Thank you. It's a tremendous privilege to be with you.